Good morning. The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security will come to order. Without objection, the Chair may declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Today's hearing will examine the Transportation Security Administration's use of security directives and proposed rulemaking in transportation sector cybersecurity regulations. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, this subcommittee is examining how the Transportation Security Administration utilizes security directives and public rules to manage cybersecurity risks within the transportation sector. In today's interconnected world, cybersecurity is more than just an IT issue. It is a critical component of our national security. Cyber threats have become pervasive, and their potential impact on critical infrastructure has profound implications for the safety and stability of our society and the resilience of our economy. Nowhere is this more evident than our transportation systems, which serve as the backbone of the American economy. These systems connect our communities, support commerce, and facilitate the movement of goods and services across the country and around the world. Our transportation networks, spanning aviation, rail, public transit, highways, pipelines, and maritime ports, are increasingly reliant on complex digital systems for operations and coordination. This reliance makes them especially vulnerable to cyber attacks by criminal groups and nation-state actors. Moreover, as emerging technologies like autonomous vehicles, connected infrastructure, and artificial intelligence become more integrated into our transportation systems, the cybersecurity and landscape grows more complex. These advances, while offering new efficiencies and capabilities, also create additional access points that cyber criminals and nation-state adversaries could exploit. A cyber attack on any of these systems could disrupt travel, halt commerce, threaten public safety, and create cascading effects across our economy and national security landscape. Whether through ransomware attacks, data breaches, or other malicious cyber activities, such threats have the potential to cause extensive harm, demonstrating the need for targeted cybersecurity regulations within the transportation sector. Safeguarding our transportation infrastructure is not only about securing physical assets. It's also about protecting the digital networks that power and control them, ensuring resilience in the face of evolving threats. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, established to protect our nation's transportation systems, has an essential and increasingly complex role in defending these critical networks against cyber threats. With its mandates to secure the nation's vast transportation infrastructure, covering everything from aviation and rail to maritime and public transit, TSA is tasked not only with physical security, but also with developing and enforcing cybersecurity regulations across the industry. I have concerns about TSA's current approach. In recent years, TSA has issued numerous security directives aimed at addressing cyber risks. However, these directives often seem reactive, hastily implemented, and lacking the necessary consultation with stakeholders. Industry feedback indicates that these directives can be overly prescriptive rather than performance-based, limiting operators' abilities to tailor cybersecurity practices to their specific operational needs. A security directive that lacks clarity and flexibility may do more harm than good. Instead of fostering robust security measures, it can lead to confusion, inefficiency, and checkbox mentality, where compliance is valued over actual risk reduction. Moreover, the lack of collaboration with industry experts, the people who understand these systems best, raises concerns about whether these directives are even capable of addressing the most pressing vulnerabilities. On November 6th, less than 2 weeks ago, TSA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that aims to establish mandatory cyber risk management and reporting requirements for certain surface transportation owners and operators. The sheer complexity of these regulations, spanning over 300 pages, is overwhelming, especially considering smaller operators who are already operating with limited resources. These proposed rules raise an important question. Will they effectively fulfill their intended purpose by reducing cybersecurity risks within the transportation sector, or will they simply place an undue burden on operators? TSA should empower operators with the flexibility to develop and implement tailored cybersecurity strategies that best address their unique risks and operational needs. When I was the mayor of Miami-Dade County, I focused on reducing overhead and streamlining regulations to enable business innovation and improve government efficiency. I believe the same approach is essential as we work to effectively protect our nation's transportation systems from cybersecurity risks. By balancing regulatory standards with operational adaptability, we can promote robust cybersecurity practices that both protect critical infrastructure and foster innovation and efficiency within the industry. Thank you to our witnesses from both panels for appearing before the subcommittee. I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanadar, for his opening statements.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Jimenez, for holding today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us. The May 2021 ransomware attack against Colonial Pipeline served as a major turning point in TSA's approach to securing transportation systems from cyber attacks. Prior to the attack, TSA's efforts to ensure the cybersecurity of transportation systems relied largely upon voluntary cooperation and adoption of recommended guidelines and best practices. The attack had far-reaching impacts as Colonial Pipeline shut down the transportation of fuel throughout the pipeline, which services much of southeastern United States. The public flocked to gas stations, leading to long lines and fuel shortages. In the aftermath of the attack, TSA assumed a more regulatory posture towards transportation cybersecurity, acting quickly to issue the first ever cybersecurity directives for pipeline systems and facilities. TSA followed that initial security directive with similar mandates for owners and operators of freight rail, passenger rail, public transit systems, as well as changes to security programs for airports and air carriers. TSA required owners and operators to adopt essential cybersecurity measures, such as designating a cybersecurity coordinator and reporting cyber incidents. TSA engaged extensively with industry stakeholders and quickly learned that its mandate were viewed as too prescriptive and inflexible. To provide regulated parties with enough flexibility to innovate and respond to evolving threats, TSA developed a novel approach in subsequent directives, focusing on desired performance and security outcomes rather than specific measures. Over the past couple of years, TSA has continued to refine its approach through extensive engagement with stakeholders. Earlier this month, TSA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking to codify cybersecurity requirements for owners and operators of pipeline rails and over-the-road bus systems. TSA's proposal, which is currently open for comments, would require system owners and operators to establish and execute a comprehensive cyber risk management program, representing a significant step forward in the evolution of TSA's cybersecurity efforts. The maturation of those efforts is also reflected in recent adjustments to TSA's investment in cybersecurity. In fiscal year 2021, prior to the Colonial Pipeline attack, Congress funded TSA cybersecurity activities at $86 million with 86 dedicated positions. Now, in fiscal year 2024, that investment has increased to $137 million and 167 positions. For fiscal year 2025, the Biden-Harris administration has requested an additional increase of 8 million and 41 positions. I hope Congress will continue to support TSA's efforts to enhance the cybersecurity of the transportation sector. To those who may question the need for regulations of TSA's use of emergency security directives, I would note that if TSA continued to rely on voluntary compliance with recommended guidelines and another attack like the attack on Colonial Pipeline were to occur, the public would rail against both TSA and Congress for allowing a disproven approach to continue. Our adversaries are continuing to adopt and pursue offensive cyber capabilities. Now is the time for TSA and its partner to ensure our security defenses are fully fortified. I thank the chairman and our witnesses again, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thanedar. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Again, I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this critical topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Steve Lorenz serves as the Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Security Operations at the Transportation Security Administration. Mr. Chad Gorman serves as the Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Operations Support at the Transportation Security Administration. Ms. Tina Wan Sherman serves as the Director for the Homeland Security and Justice Team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. I thank each of our distinguished witnesses for being here today. I now recognize Mr. Lorenz for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me and inviting me for this hearing. My name is Steve Lorenz. As you mentioned, I'm the Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Security Operations. I have the privilege to work with and oversee 57,000 employees within security operations. Under our portfolio, we have domestic aviation operations, which oversees 433 airports across the country. We also have international operations, which we have assets throughout the world. We oversee surface operations, we oversee compliance operations, and we have an administrative function which oversees our administrative functions within security operations. We also have 2 senior liaison positions. One is with CISA, and the other is with the State Department. So it's a pleasure once again to be here. I look forward to the questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lorenz. I now recognize Mr. Gorman for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Good morning, Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Thanedar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Chad Gorman, and I am the Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Operations Support at TSA. In this role, I'm responsible for TSA's intelligence operations, regulatory policy, and stakeholder engagement, as well as other programs. I am joined today by Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Security Operations, Steve Lorenz. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss TSA's role in cybersecurity for our nation's transportation infrastructure. As the members of this committee know well, cyber attacks are an evolving and persistent threat. Cyber actors, specifically nation states like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, have demonstrated their intent and ability to conduct malicious cyber activity targeting critical infrastructure by exploiting inherent vulnerabilities of both operational technology and IT systems. These nation-state threat actors have developed and demonstrated capabilities that pose significant cyber threats to the United States, our critical infrastructure, and the transportation sector. As the Director of National Intelligence has stated, our adversaries and strategic competitors have the intent and ability to pre-position cyber attack exploits that can be used against U.S. critical infrastructure, including transportation. In fact, we have observed highly sophisticated activity attributed to the People's Republic of China assessed as pre-positioning for disruptive attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure, including transportation sector, in the event of a major crisis or conflict with the United States. In response to these urgent threats, the TSA administrator has utilized his emergency authorities found in both statute and regulation to issue security directives and emergency security program amendments immediately to protect transportation security. The administrator may use these authorities upon finding that immediate action is necessary to protect transportation security. The TSA administrator's ability to leverage these unique authorities and respond immediately during emergency situations has significantly mitigated threats posed by a rapidly evolving cyber environment. These emergency authorities are a vital component of the nation's securing the nation's transportation system and allow the TSA administrator to act to prevent harm to transportation in the event of catastrophic consequences. Following the 2021 cyber incident at a major U.S. pipeline, the TSA administrator leveraged his unique authorities to require transportation and infrastructure stakeholders, both surface and aviation, to implement a variety of cybersecurity protections. These measures include mandatory reporting of cybersecurity instances, designating a cybersecurity coordinator, requiring high-risk pipeline, freight railroad, passenger rail, and rail transit operators to develop cybersecurity implementation, response, and assessment plans, and reporting to TSA on their efforts on a recurring basis. The administrator consulted industry partners regarding these measures and provided multiple threat briefings to CEOs and other industry representatives. These measures were developed with extensive collaboration with industry stakeholders, which allowed TSA to better understand the threat landscape and gather industry feedback. It was through this feedback loop that TSA learned that our initial approach to cybersecurity and surface modes was too prescriptive. Based on that feedback, TSA quickly transitioned our regulatory framework in 2022 to an outcome-focused, performance-based model, empowering our industry partners and allowing us to collectively address cybersecurity issues with measures tailored specifically to transportation environments. In parallel with these emergency measures, TSA continued to pursue more permanent changes through notice and comment rulemaking process, culminating in the issuance of a notice of proposed rulemaking earlier this month. This proposed rule is intended to codify the provisions of the recent security directives into a cybersecurity risk management program. The proposed rule continues TSA's commitment to a performance-based requirements and builds on TSA's previously issued cybersecurity requirements aimed at establishing sustainable and comprehensive cyber risk management programs for owners and operators with high risk profiles. TSA welcomes and encourages industry comment on this proposed rule. Continuing collaboration with industry partners, as well as with interagency partners such as the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the Department of Transportation, and the United States Coast Guard, is critical to securing the nation's transportation sector from cybersecurity threats. Industry engagement to date has led directly to better cybersecurity outcomes. TSA is committed to continuing this engagement as these threats evolve. I want to thank the committee for its interest in cybersecurity of the transportation sector and for its continuing support of TSA and its unique authorities. I would like to also publicly thank the dedicated employees of TSA for the work they do every day to secure the nation's transportation systems. Thank you, Chairman Jimenez and Ranking Member Tanadar, for the opportunity to testify today. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gorman. I now recognize Ms.
Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you this morning. The threat landscape today is not quite what we had envisioned following the tragic events that occurred on September 11th. Current threat assessments cite the increasing prevalence and sophistication of cyber attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure, including on the transportation systems sector. Considered one of the lifeline sectors, transportation systems includes aviation and surface modes and moves billions of passengers along with millions of tons of goods every year. How this sector and others are fundamentally critical to our nation's economic stability and our everyday lives was brought into clear relief after the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline in 2021. More recently, Volt Typhoon's ability to compromise internet-connected devices in the transportation systems sector, as well as other critical infrastructure sectors, have raised significant concerns about the extent of the impact a cyber attack would have on the U.S. if carried out as part of a major conflict by a foreign adversary. The agency I represent, GAO, included the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure as part of its high-risk list over 20 years ago. And since that time, we have made numerous recommendations on cybersecurity in the transportation systems sector. For example, in 2019, 2 years before Colonial Pipeline, we reported it on weaknesses in TSA's management of its pipeline security efforts. Since that time, TSA has implemented all but one of our recommendations. The remaining recommendation is for TSA to update its 2010 Pipeline Security and Incident Recovery Protocol Plan to ensure the plan reflects laws, policies, and changes in pipeline security threats, such as cybersecurity. TSA officials told us they anticipate completion of the updated protocol plan by July of next year. TSA has used its various statutorily granted authorities to help secure all modes of the transportation system. This includes issuing security directives and emergency amendments in response to threats, events, or significant vulnerabilities, as well as recently initiating rulemaking to develop cybersecurity regulations for freight and passenger rail, pipelines, and more limitedly, over-the-road buses. Over the past 5 years, GAO has reviewed TSA security directives and emergency amendments in both aviation and surface transportation systems, and has made recommendations to clarify the process for renewing such directives and amendments and for obtaining and documenting stakeholder input. We also recently reported that TSA was unable to demonstrate that its security directives and emergency amendments align with leading practices for ransomware. As it moves through its rulemaking process for surface transportation, TSA should consider leading practices GAO has identified to improve the effectiveness of the process, including incorporating project management practices such as timely communication with external stakeholders about the rulemaking's process and progress, as well as other details. TSA should also be prepared to address some of the factors that can delay rulemaking, such as the complexity of the issues covered, shifts in administration and agency priorities, and the availability of resources to carry out a rulemaking. In closing, TSA must be positioned to effectively mitigate cybersecurity threats to ensure the safe movement of people and goods across our nation's transportation systems. GAO will continue to assist Congress in the oversight of TSA's efforts. I'd like to thank my GAO colleagues for their tremendous support in my preparation, and to the subcommittee for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Sherman. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Back to you, Ms. Sherman. This 300-page document, what do you consider that? Is it more check the box reporting requirements, or does it actually help industry in protecting itself from cyber attacks?
While we haven't done an in-depth analysis of the recent rulemaking, we know that there's a number of the requirements that are carried over from the existing security directives intended to help, of course, improve the cybersecurity of surface transportation. We also think that training that's potentially to be implemented that's included as part of the rulemaking is a positive step forward. Deterrence is always really difficult, of course, to measure, but we do see this as an important step forward by TSA.
Mr. Gorman, in terms of the rulemaking itself, I mean, as you were speaking, I'm looking at, let's focus, say, on rail, okay? Mm-hmm. So much of this country's commerce, energy, et cetera, runs on rails. How much of our infrastructure now is interconnected and dependent on electronic systems for switching, scheduling, et cetera, making sure that that train is on this track at this time, et cetera, et cetera? How much of that is automated? How much of it is really susceptible to a cyber attack?
Specifically in the rail environment?
Yeah.
So I don't have an exact number for you, Chairman, but it is a large portion, particularly with the enactment of systems like mandatory positive train control and the interconnectedness thereof of the rail network. It is a federal requirement that those rail entities actually have that system in operation for safety purposes. And so that system, as well as things like switching and others, are what provided TSA the methodology by which we scoped in those rail entities that you see within the NPRM language, particularly those Class 1 rail entities that provide the bulk of the movement for the goods and services that you just referenced, sir, as well as a small amount of short line and regional railroads that, while of a smaller entity size, provide critical functions to the function of the overall system, or provide critical national security functions in the rail environment that we deemed as necessary for the protection of this rule.
How vulnerable are we to, say, a massive cyber attack on our rail system that basically paralyzes our rail system in the United States?
I think it varies across the system, sir, and these measures particularly are meant to raise the cyber resiliency of both rail, pipeline, and other entities that fall within the scope. And built off of specifically industry standards as listed in things like existing NIST cybersecurity frameworks, as well as CISR's recently cybersecurity performance goals to make sure that we are continuing to raise the bar for cybersecurity, particularly in these critical assets in transportation.
But no matter how much you raise the bar for cybersecurity, this is a constant game of one-upmanship, right? And eventually, if somebody really wants to penetrate it, eventually you have to account for the eventuality of us losing that or somebody penetrating the system and wreaking havoc on the United States. In these rules, do you account for that, and do you mandate resiliency so that, worst case scenario, you have to get off the grid? Will we be able to still transport goods and services by the old method? Or are we so reliant on the new method that we've forgotten the old method and we'll be basically stuck in gridlock?
So given the dynamic nature of the cybersecurity freight that we face now and we anticipate facing in the future, I think there's three primary areas of this rule that are germane to your question. First, we learned based on the performance of the requirements that are existing in our current issued SDs of a performance-based model is the model to move into both now and into the future. These requirements that we have in the NPRM as posted, we believe provide both specificity in the outcomes that we are requiring as well as flexibility for operators to adapt those to their specific operations, systems, and technologies to achieve those. As well as our overall goal is to prevent the disruption of critical services. And so as we are looking to work with industry, we drive these requirements at those critical assets that are determined within their operations. And thirdly, we are mandating that these owner-operators develop, maintain, and regularly exercise response plans, particularly for potential incidents that may occur on or directly to their networks to provide redundancy and an ability to quickly respond and recover from those instances.
Thank you. My time is up. Now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Thanadar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Lawrence and Mr. Gorman, in the aftermath of the Colonial Pipeline attack, Congress has consistently supported TSA's request for additional cybersecurity resources and personnel. For fiscal year 2025, the Biden-Harris administration has requested an additional 8,041 positions for TSA's cybersecurity activities. How will that funding and those positions be used to enhance TSA's efforts? And what more does TSA need from Congress to further advance transportation cybersecurity?
Thank you for that question. First of all, I think it's really important to acknowledge the support that we have received and continue to receive, and we're very, very appreciative of that. Currently, in the aviation sector, we have oversight of 168 entities. In the surface sector, we have oversight of 155, and that's going to also grow moving into next year. The resource allocation, the 41 positions that you alluded to, is going to help tremendously as we continue to move forward. Currently, within our security operations structure for both aviation, we have 32 employees that are allocated to provide support for those 168 entities. So as you could tell, the scope of the work is great, especially with some of the requirements and some of the pivoting that we have done based on industry feedback. And I just want to share one of those things. So industry has been instrumental in building this partnership and support with TSA. And they requested a couple things, which we worked with them on. One is to not submit their information to us. So our inspection timeline went from 2 days to maybe a week. So that drives additional resources. Also within the surface sector, we have about 60 employees that are allocated to handle about 155 entities. So the workload is there, but we truly appreciate the support that we continue to receive, and we look forward to also the President's budget, which identifies these positions. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would add one more thing to Mr. Lorenz's response there as well, is that we also have critical responsibilities as a sector risk management agency to not only regulate within this space, but then also specifically to provide support to the industry stakeholders both in the service and aviation domains. These resources will also provide greater ability for us to engage on a regular and repeating basis with our industry stakeholders as they both implement these measures, as also face cybersecurity threats directly at their networks, as well as provide actionable intelligence directly to CIOs and CISOs within these company structures, so they can help best guide threat hunting teams and other preparatory measures above and beyond those measures that are required to additionally provide protections across transportation.
Thank you. Now, at times we have heard complaints about TSA's use of and reliance on security directives. However, statute requires the TSA administrator to immediately issue a security directive whenever the administrator determines that doing so is necessary to protect transportation security. The authority to issue security directives allow the TSA administrator to respond quickly and effectively to imminent threats. The regulatory process is simply not always fast enough to keep up with the evolving intelligence landscape. My question is, how critical is TSA's security directive authority to the agency's ability to carry out its mission? Aside from TSA's recent cybersecurity efforts, how else has TSA used the security directives to protect transportation security? And if TSA has not moved immediately following the Colonial Pipeline attack to issue cybersecurity directives across several transportation modes, would our transportation sector have been left vulnerable?
First question, thank you for the question. We believe that the administrators' emergency authorities are vital to the security of the transportation sector. We have used these authorities both, as you mentioned here in this hearing, on several instances over the last several years to ensure that we were rapidly responding to the ever persistent and direct threats posed by our cybersecurity adversaries. With regards to other instances beyond cybersecurity, we would be happy to provide the members a listing of that, as that information is sensitive security information and we cannot discuss those details here in this hearing. We will be able to follow up with you directly after this hearing to provide you a summary of several examples of their usage.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member, and I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lawrence, you are the Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Security Operations for TSA under the United States Department of Homeland Security, correct?
That is correct.
Mr. Gorman, you are the Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Operations Support for TSA under DHS, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so just so America knows, we got two of the honchos here in front of us as it relates to TSA regulations and the effort to introduce security enhancements for our industry partners that fall under the jurisdictional authority of TSA, like our stakeholders running rail and pipelines. In the effort to protect our nation's infrastructure from cyber threat, largely Americans feel quite vulnerable from cyber threat. From sea to shining sea, we are not reassured by what we read in the news every day about a major cyber breach in this industry, a major cyber breach from that massive bank, another major cyber breach in this large government entity. Americans generally get it that this thing is a moving target and it is a serious threat, and we as a nation, we have to respond. So TSA has its role to play, and Congress has given the Transportation Security Administration the authority to issue what are called security directives. Is that correct, gentlemen?
That is correct.
Okay, so in that time frame, which is in recent history, since 2021, in the effort as a nation to respond to cyber threats, the TSA has issued security directives intended for use against specific threat assessment or threats However, those security directives have been referenced as generally disruptive to operations and requiring a great deal of coordinated effort at the implementation point that takes away from actual monitoring of threat. There's only so many staff available within the actual entities that operate, say in our rail and pipelines. And if those men and women that are dedicated, they work in that office, if they have to spend so much of their time and energy complying with the regulatory requirements, then they're not investing that energy in the actual monitoring of threats and responding to threats. So we have a responsibility to attempt to do better. Not that the initial effort was not well intended, and it's just that we're dealing with an emerging and complex threat for the first time in our history. So, Mr. Lorenz and Mr. Gorman, 2 years ago, Congress passed legislation setting guidelines for reporting cyber attacks at 72 hours. You have to report this within 72 hours to streamline this in the interest of time. Yet in TSA's rule, 72 hours. So in TSA's rule said, well, we're going to do it within 24 hours. And the Securities and Exchange Commission finalized rules in 2022 saying it had 4 business days. So there's a variety of actual implementation responses happening across the government entities that we must harmonize. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record a media report from November of this year regarding the bipartisan effort to clean up cyber regulations and to pass legislation that indeed does harmonize our cybersecurity efforts. That would be H.R. 10123.
Without objection.
Thank you. Gentlemen, and we probably have time if the chairman would indulge. Do you see anything more important, Mr. Lorenz and Mr. Gorman, anything more important than harmonization of our security efforts to protect our nation's infrastructure from cyber threat?
TSA supports the overall goal of harmonizing cybersecurity requirements with our industry stakeholders. This is an area specifically where we asked for feedback in the NPRM, and based on that feedback, based on other efforts and interagency discussions that are ongoing, we anticipate to be able to incorporate that as we move forward into a final rule stage.
Thank you. Mr. Lorenz?
Yeah, I just wanted to also add to Chad's point that it's really important for us to make sure that we continue to collaborate with our stakeholders and provide and receive feedback. And to your question and to your comment, I think it's really important to also address since May of 2021, just in the surface realm, we have held over 300 industry engagements, whether it's briefings or calls, to make sure that industry had the opportunity to provide feedback so we can receive that feedback and pivot accordingly. And also within the aviation sector, just this year alone, we have had the opportunity to receive feedback from our aviation partners over 126 times to make sure that we understood and we received the feedback based on their operational needs and necessities. So we continue to listen, because I think it's really, really important to understand that we're on a journey together. And I really, really appreciate the question and the thought about harmonization as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the indulgence.
Thank you, gentlemen from Louisiana. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Lee.
Good morning, and thank you all so much for being here with us today. Mr. Lorenz, Mr. Gorman, I'd like to start by addressing this question to both of you, and that is, I'm interested in what are some of the critical things that you identified or addressed through security directives that TSA is considering as part of the formal regulatory process.
I think the most important lesson that we learn collectively with our industry stakeholders in the issuance and the performance of the requirements within our current security directives is that there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to cybersecurity, particularly when it comes to the complexity of the threat and the complexity of business and operational technology networks in place today. And so we believe and have learned the lesson through the issuance and the maintenance of those requirements in the SDs and moving those into this proposed rule, that a performance-based model is the only way that we will be successful and our partners will be successful in continuing to prevent disruptive attacks against our nation's transportation infrastructure. We believe that as you look at the requirements of this rule set, that theme has carried over, but particularly we are interested in industry feedback as it relates to both the opportunities that provides them to customize these performance-based requirements for their own business operations, as well as potential challenges that they see and how we can incorporate that into the final rule.
And tell me, if you would, how that performance-based model accommodates the different sectors that you are attempting to regulate.
So I believe, again, in the same model is that we established outcome-based goals across our requirements that are based, again, in industry standards like we see in this cybersecurity framework, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency's performance-based cyber goals, and have given those as the platform. Given the model that we have put in place and are seeing results already of in the SDs, we then work with individual owners and operators to craft specific implementation plans for those measures that are specific to their industry, their technologies, their operations, and the size and scope of those operations, and the technologies both from a business and from an operational technology perspective that they operate. And then based on that and based on an assessment of criticality, they then propose to TSA a timeline of investments and actions to drive towards those requirements. And we have seen early successes in that model and anticipate continuing that as we move into the final rule.
So is it your assessment that that is a sufficient way to identify regulatory requirements that are unique enough for each of the different sectors, that that is a sufficient way to accommodate the notion that each of them needs something a little bit different, and the best practices and requirements for each of those different subsectors should be a little bit different? You think that's an adequate way to address it?
I think not only do we believe it's adequate, we believe that is one, again, an essential way to provide the flexibility across infrastructure, as well as provide flexibility for continuing adapting in persistent threat environment. And so as we again move into a permanent rule stage, we believe that is the way that we will proceed and actually work with our partners for ultimate success.
And Mr. Lorenz, anything to add on that subject?
Yeah, thank you. I think to the points that were made earlier, I think for us, the relationship building is really, really critical. Understanding industry, and to the previous answer, that one size does not fit every one of those entities, making sure that they're able to work together. One thing that's really, really important to mention is that as they build those plans are built with us. We help them through that journey. It's also important to note, before we send out any teams to do any inspections or assessments, we have conversations that take place weeks before to make sure that they're ready. This is not a gotcha mentality. This is all about making sure that we keep the system safe. So we spend a lot of time investing, making sure that at the end we have a great product and that product is safe. And if there's anything that we need to do to pivot to make sure that we're able to adjust, then we do that accordingly.
And is TSA adequately resourced to implement what the proposed rules require?
So we appreciate the support that we have received, as I stated earlier, and we look forward to receiving the additional 41 assets that is in the FY25 President's budget.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you to the gentlewoman from Florida. I want to thank the witnesses, Mr. Lawrence, Mr. Gorman, and Dr. Sherman, for your valuable testimony, and the members for their questions. The witnesses are now dismissed, and the committee will stand in brief recess, very brief recess, while the clerks arrange for the second panel of witnesses. Committee will come to order. I am pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses. I ask that the witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on the Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our second panel of witnesses. Mr. Ian Jeffries serves as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of American Railroads. Ms. Kimberly Denbo serves as the Vice President of Security and Operations for the American Gas Association. I thank each of our distinguished witnesses for being here today. I now recognize Mr. Jeffries for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Good morning, Chairman Jimenez, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, where I have the privilege of representing the nation's freight railroads. Running across 140,000 miles of privately funded infrastructure, railroads rely on advanced technology and skilled employees to operate safely and keep goods moving every day. Safety, physical and digital, is at the core of all railroads do. And pertaining to cybersecurity specifically, as you know, it is a continuous arms race between attackers and defenders, with railroads committed to constantly improving protection. And if you take away one thing from me today, I hope it is this: railroads have a track record and a system in place to meet the cyber challenges of today and tomorrow. We prioritize cybersecurity through a well-established risk-based and collaborative approach, actively working with government entities like TSA and CISA to improve and adapt cybersecurity measures. This includes regularly scheduled interaction between industry and our government partners, where both threats and preparedness levels are analyzed in depth. Moreover, railroads have a long-standing commitment to protecting their operations through coordinated efforts and continuous evaluation of cybersecurity plans. Our unified security plan evolves with input from private and government experts to address emerging threats effectively. With that, let me turn to some details. As I mentioned, railroads emphasize information sharing with agencies like TSA and CISA to stay ahead of threats. Rail industry leadership has played a central role as well, starting with the establishment of a unified cybersecurity plan over 20 years ago. Cybersecurity plans are implemented by two bodies: the Rail Security Working Committee, which focuses on countering terrorism, and the Rail Information Security Committee, composed of information security leaders from major railroads. Together, these committees form the Rail Sector Coordinating Council, railroads' main channel for coordinating with government on cybersecurity. Looking forward, while railroads and other entities have been reporting incidents for several years, railroads would benefit from CISA regularly updating its cyber profile based on attack analyses across sectors, as timely reports back to industry are crucial for staying informed about emerging threats and potential bad actors. In looking at the risk management rule, AAR appreciates the open regulatory approach TSA has finally taken with regard to its recent NPRM on cyber risk management. The industry is still reviewing the rule, which just came out this month, and will offer detailed comments. In our initial review of the NPRM, we did identify a few long-standing issues railroads have repeatedly raised with TSA that were not addressed in the NPRM. For example, and as mentioned earlier, the proposed rule requires a reporting of a cyber incident within 24 hours, which conflicts with the statutory requirement of 72 hours, further conflicting with SEC requirements of 4 days. Not only could this conflict create confusion and was easily avoidable, but the earlier deadline may divert resources from immediate ongoing attack response to comply with the reporting requirement. The rule also continues to require that any security coordinator be a U.S. citizen, which is impossible for the Canadian Class I railroads who operate throughout the U.S. as well. We look forward to addressing these issues and others throughout the public comment period, and will continue to engage in conversations with TSA and other government partners to ensure any final rule protects railroads, employees, and the communities in which we operate. And as I said, we were pleased to see TSA issue this proposed rule through a normal regulatory process after several years of issuing security directives under its emergency authorities. While emergency authorities might be necessary in the rare instance of a true identifiable immediate threat, AAR prefers the collaborative regulation of TSA's use over TSA's use of directives, which, while faster, bypass public input, and risk leading to unnecessary requirements that lack security justification. One-size-fits-all prescriptive mandates can be counterproductive by failing to recognize the modal differences in their cyber preparedness. As I mentioned, Railroad's first cybersecurity plan was established over 20 years ago. Overly prescriptive regulation also risks stifling innovation necessary to adapt to constantly changing threats, something that is happening every day. AAR supports performance-based standards, and that was a welcome message from the prior panel, to allow flexibility in responding to fast-evolving threats. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Ms. Jeffries. I now recognize Ms. Dembow for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Jimenez, members of the subcommittee, I'm Kimberly Denbo, Vice President of Security and Operations of the American Committee and co-chaired the standing up of its Cyber Subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to this hearing to share our experiences as they relate to how TSA puts its regulatory authority into practice. America's natural gas utilities and TSA share a common mission: critical infrastructure and operator security. For over 2 decades, TSA and natural gas utilities have challenged the traditional regulatory model, piloting forward-leaning approaches to achieve a common mission, to achieve our common mission, critical infrastructure and operator security. While TSA has full authority to regulate pipeline security, it boldly opted for an unconventional and more effective model TSA coins as structured oversight. TSA recognized early on the strength in the pipeline sector's operational diversity and that system disruptions and consequences differ substantially across the natural gas and oil value chains. While the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident in 2021 propelled TSA into regulating pipeline cybersecurity, TSA and owner-operators had been weighing the importance of pipeline cybersecurity well before 2021. Over the decade following the 2012 Chinese cybersecurity campaign that targeted pipelines, TSA and pipeline owner-operators worked collaboratively to advance pipeline cybersecurity maturity. Beyond basic cybersecurity hygiene, TSA realized there is no single cybersecurity law, regulation, or standard that can be universally applied across pipelines without having to allow the option of alternative measures or system-by-system customization. Regardless, public pressure in the aftermath of the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident drove TSA to issue a series of prescriptive emergency security directives covering pipeline cybersecurity. The first iteration of security directives was depicted by inapplicable cybersecurity measures and unattainable compliance timelines. AGA worked tirelessly educating TSA about the operator's concerns. TSA ultimately hosted a series of pipeline security directive technical round direction of the security directives towards a risk-based, outcome-focused approach. Let's get real. A proactively informed regulator is less likely to promulgate unclear, misinformed, and unworkable regulations. We recognize security directives serve a logical purpose. Imminent threats require immediate action. As demonstrated by the technical roundtables and subsequent TSA-hosted forums, there are benefits from leveraging security directives to improve security requirements before embedded into final rules. There must be a balance, however, because each iteration of the pipeline security directives results in reallocation of security resources on the part of the owner-operator. Congress should place guardrails on this regulatory mechanism to reduce its potential for future abuse or misuse. Hallelujah. After 4 years of being regulated by security directives, TSA finally issued cybersecurity regulations, proposed cybersecurity regulations. AGA member utilities favor reasonable pipeline cybersecurity regulations that are attainable, sustainable, and auditable. And we applaud TSA for sticking with the risk-based, outcome-focused approach. We look forward to submitting constructive comments intended to advance TSA's and AGA member natural gas utilities' common mission. I would like to add, and I think that this is very important to spotlight, I want to spotlight an unresolved concern that applies to the pipeline security directives, to the TSA cybersecurity rulemaking, and appears to be a systemic problem across the government. The fixation on collecting and aggregating security operations-related sensitive information of critical infrastructure. There lacks rhyme and reason as to why any government entity in this threat environment would be compelled to take possession of critical infrastructure's most sensitive security operations-related information. It's ironic, the onus is on the owner and operator to limit the vulnerabilities introduced by subpar government cybersecurity performance, which continues to play itself out incident after incident. This is the one area where the government continues to fail in our common mission. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to the exchange.
Thank you, Ms. Denbo. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And Ms. Denbo, can you elaborate on your last statement? You seem to be, heaping praise on TSA and the new regulations, hoping that new directives will be fewer and fewer. But then you ended up on kind of a sour note. So I'd like to home in on that. Can you elaborate on what you just said at the end?
Yes, sir, and thank you very much for your firefighting service. Appreciate that. This has been an ongoing point of contention between the pipeline sector and TSA, and I will tell you, we have a very positive relationship with TSA from over many, 2 decades of working with them. And our concern is that there seems to be this, like I said, fixation on the part of every government entity, including TSA, that in order for them to prove that operators are doing what they're doing, or in order for the non-performance-based regulations to check the box for compliance, the government has to take control or possession of our sensitive operations-related information. And when I refer to that, I'm talking about specifically, example, in the proposed rule, TSA talks about us submitting identification of critical cyber systems, specific network architecture, baseline communications, detailed measures to protect our critical cyber systems, measures to address response to, recovery from, and from a cyber incident. If we're gonna give all of this to TSA for them to hold on to, we might as well just give it to China or to Russia, because there is no storage system for data that is impenetrable. And from third-party, unauthorized third-party access to insider threat, which is my bigger concern, there is no reason for the government to have possession of this information. We have worked diligently with TSA, and as pointed out by the recent panelists, that they are coming on site for on-site inspections. Yes, it takes longer for the inspections, but then it allows us to prevent that vulnerability of TSA taking possession of our critical information.
Do you have has TSA given you a reason why they require that? Because I actually agree with you that once you give it away to the government, to us, there is no guarantee that a adversary nation state can't access it through us and therefore put you at risk. Why does TSA need this?
I don't necessarily think it's just TSA. I think it is a federal government and state government belief that in order for them to protect us, they need to have our critical information. It's our job as the owner-operator to protect us. It's TSA's and the federal government's job to protect the community, the nation. We should be able to do that together without putting the owner-operators in a vulnerable position that they would otherwise not be if they do not have to share that information. TSA's concern, as I understand it, has been the increased amount of time that they would have to spend on-site for inspections. And while I recognize that, and I do say that TSA does not have the resources that it needs, it is working diligently to really achieve all that it needs to. But making an inspection on site last for a couple of days longer so that my owner-operators can sleep better at night, not worried that an insider threat or a nation state could hack into a system that has been proven through DHS, through DOE, name the three-letter or government organization that has not been compromised. That is why.
Ms. Dunbar, I think all entities can be compromised. And at the end, no matter what we do, if somebody puts their mind to it, they can probably get into wherever that is they want to get into.
Yes, Chairman, and I would like to add, because it would be remiss if I didn't, TSA has gone above and beyond to try to protect this information, but we just have to accept the reality that nothing is impenetrable.
And because of that, my belief is that, yes, we try to put up as many safeguards as possible so that there's no penetration and no corruption. However, I'm more inclined to say, okay, assume that you are corrupted and assume that you are attacked. How can you get back to operations as quickly as possible, knowing that you will be attacked and that you will be disabled? And so my problem with the entire cyber world is our over-reliance on it and also the lack of institutional knowledge of how to operate things without technology, the old-fashioned way, because we may have to resort to that. And unfortunately, we just become more and more reliant on electronic systems, on digital systems, where we're becoming more and more vulnerable to it. That's my problem. Anyway, my 5 minutes are up. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries, regulations that are meant to enhance security should not be overly burdensome. And we're going to get to the gentlelady's point, because I think that's an important conversation. But regarding rail, the operation of our rail systems is absolutely critical to the performance of our nation. The historical significance of rail systems working in a cooperative manner with every sovereign state's government and local municipalities, and with operating under federal regulation, and with thousands and thousands of industry stakeholders that are required to plug into the rail systems. It's quite a complex thing when you really look at it. So the regulations that the federal government places upon you, intended to enhance security, yes, of course, but in my assessment is that they're far too burdensome and can interfere with business, as the gentlelady pointed out. But how does that relate to financial costs? Do you find that in your interactions with TSA and the effort to enhance security regulations and cyber threat for rail, is there fair and due consideration given to the financial impact of the rail industry?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. You know, we've been at this a long time. You kind of referenced that, about 200 years of moving goods around the country and doing it to a high degree of safety. And we take our responsibility with the utmost of seriousness to move goods safely and securely, because we move all variety of goods that Americans rely on every single day. And cybersecurity is a key portion of that. And as I mentioned, we've been at that since before the year 2000, in advance of Y2K. And we have had a productive, positive relationship overall with the TSA. Certainly can't say that for every government agency, so it's worth highlighting that. But to your point, we've got to think about the cost-benefit equation. And so, to my colleague's point, are we spending more time checking boxes and fulfilling requirements for requirements' sake, or are we maximizing security for maximizing security's sake? And certainly there's a cost, there's a financial cost, there's a human resource cost, there's a physical and digital asset cost.
So is that fairly evaluated, is my question. In your interaction with TSA, is the financial impact fairly evaluated?
So I would say it's acknowledged. Whether or not it's fairly evaluated, I'll let you know when we file our comments once we get through this massive rule.
Okay, well, I'll take that as your answer. Be reassured and for your partners across the country, and we are watching that. I mean, the financial impact is significant, and it has to be part of the formula.
I would quickly say that I think that's why it's so important that you have a designated problem you're trying to solve, an outcomes-based approach versus an inputs-based approach. And so that's a core philosophy of ours. And
well, that's a common sense answer, sir. I'm not sure that's allowed in D.C.
Okay, fair enough.
Ms. Denbo, you see, quoting you, you said that the government essentially seeks control or possession of your critical infrastructure systems, and you're saying that in order for the government to check your cybersecurity compliance, the government is compromising your cybersecurity infrastructure. And this is exactly the conservative perspective of government overreach. So would you please expound upon that? And what would be your suggestion to the federal government to get the hell out of your way and let you protect your systems?
Thank you for that colorful opening. AGA, the American Gas Association, we support reasonable cybersecurity regulations. From the natural gas utility perspective, we do not just have to answer to the federal government, we also answer to their state public utility commission. And for that, we are required to do long-term planning. And so we need a system, we need reasonable regulations that are not constantly changing so that we can do that long-term planning and justify the expenses for the sake of security. We applaud TSA for sticking with the performance-based approach. What we need TSA to do is to rely on the fact that, one, reasonable cybersecurity regulations have to be attainable. The operators have to be able to achieve them. They have to be sustainable. The operators have to be able to sustain them and keep them going. Otherwise, it's wasted money. And then TSA fills that last part is for them to be auditable. That's the part where we're always bumping heads. And that is because there are ways where TSA can audit and verify without having to take possession of our critical infrastructure information.
Because when you say taking possession, you mean that they're documenting your security mechanisms you have in place, and therefore they're exposing your security mechanisms themselves to breach by the cyber threat operators and bad actors across the world. Is that essentially what you're saying?
In a nutshell, basically, it is rather than showing what they would like is to get a copy. And we have no problems showing TSA that information. Where the challenge is when that information physically or electronically leaves our environment.
I understand. Oh, you have my commitment to address that. That's precisely the kind of thing we intend to push back against. Mr. Chairman, my time has well expired. Thank you for this hearing. I yield.
Thank you, gentlemen from Louisiana. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.